Can the US fight another war in the Middle East like it did after 9/11? Does it have the capability to do that today?
No, absolutely not. Not even close. And very few people are actually aware of this. Just kind of as a means of comparison, right now, according to Ukrainian intelligence, the Russians have somewhere around 600,000 troops inside Ukrainian territory that are fighting against that war. The United States' entire active duty army is about 450,000. And let me clarify even that is the total time of the active duty army. The actual number of fighters is probably somewhere around 80,000, maybe 100,000 total fighters. Everything else is support and service support and that kind of thing. So that's the sum total of all we have of our active duty ground forces. You would have to have a massive mobilization, bringing up reserves, the National Guard, et cetera, to fight any kind of, more than just a small skirmish kind of operation. And so that's just with the manpower here. But then there's the bigger issue of, can you fight a sustained conflict? Another thing that the Russia-Ukraine war has really exposed is that when you fight a sustained war that doesn't, end in 100 hours like Desert Storm or about a month like the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but actually is sustained combat that drags on for years, then you have a big problem with the U.S. because of our sustainment capability in our industrial base is nowhere near enough to actually sustain our fight in air defense weapons, interceptor missiles, artillery, of course, and several other categories of anti-armor weapons, et cetera. We can't sustain that, especially when we've already committed ourselves to this basically open-ended fight in the Russia-Ukraine war for Ukraine and now for Israel already in their fight there. And that's even before they may possibly escalate into Hezbollah in the southern part of Lebanon, or God forbid, an actual war against Iran as well. So if we got sucked into something like that, we flat don't have the capacity to sustain this fight for a long time.
Does the war in Ukraine represent a warning to America that a smaller power can use cheap drones to destroy incredibly expensive military equipment? Is this a warning to America's sort of fighting ability?
Well, it should be, I guess, more than a warning, just a wake-up call to everybody in the world that has any, thoughts of ever fighting, whether an offensive or a defensive conflict, that you better do everything in your power to make sure you have a lot of drones, a lot of missiles, and a lot of counter-drone capability. And a lot of counter-missile capability. If you don't have electronic warfare that is state-of-the-art, you're going to have a lot of problems. Really good example is the Ukraine side in 2023 had about a 40% success rate of their drones against the Russian side. The Russian side has figured this stuff out, and then they put a lot of effort in their electronic warfare capacity, and now, according to a report I saw just yesterday, about 10% of the Ukraine drones are actually getting through. That's why you see a lot fewer of these FPV drone videos against the Russians, because they have really put a lot of effort into the electronic warfare capacity. In the future, you still have to have tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and all that stuff. It hasn't gone away. It hasn't eliminated it, but it has lowered it in importance, but it's still critically important. But it's elevated. What's elevated above it is the drone issue and the missile issue. They have become preeminent right now. And if you don't have the capacity in drones, in missiles, and in armor, you're not going to take or hold any territory. And from what I have seen, from what the U.S. Army has been doing, they've been trying to put in a lot of lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine war, and they've made some changes, but it really looks like, at least from what's publicly announced, that it's kind of around the edges. It's incremental, and I doubt very seriously whether if we actually went into a conflict on the scale and in the nature of what the Russian and Ukraine side are both fighting, I suspect we would get a very unpleasant surprise.
In terms of the American military budget, it is huge compared to its nearest rivals. It dwarfs its competitors around the world. But I want to ask whether in the last 20 years, those competitors, Russia, China, other countries, have caught up to American military capability. Has that gap narrowed between America's dominance and that against its rivals in terms of its military?
Yeah, and one of the ways that, just looking at the dollar figures is not the best way to look at it. For example, in 155 artillery shells, I think that the number is, I think, $5,000 to $7,000 per 155 shell that the U.S. and the Western countries make, and it's like 2,000 to 3,000, or maybe it's even less than that for a 152 millimeter shell on the Russian side. So you just look at the dollar spent and you see, wow, we spent a lot more, but we got a lot less for it. And that's kind of the situation here too. And it's not just a numerical counting of things, because, man, if you just looked at the budgets, I mean, we would blow everybody in the world away, hands down. But when you look at the capacity and what that money has bought, then you have a different story. And so you have to look at the overall capacity, and that means manpower, the level of training, the type of technology, the way it's employed, and et cetera. And all those things have to go into that calculation. And so at using that definition based on your question here, I think that we have been past. And I know that the conventional wisdom is to say, no, we're still the preeminent, but they're catching up. I think when you look at what's been going on in terms of development, training, and the doctrine that's been applied and is being rehearsed on the ground in training exercises, et cetera, I think that we have been surpassed. And we have this long, 2 decades now history of, so-called combat experience, but many in the laymen think that just combat experience is combat experience. You can apply it here, you can apply it there. Absolutely not. I can tell you directly firsthand from somebody who has fought in high-intensity tank-on-tank battles, as well as conventional counterinsurgency training, military forces where you train other forces, et cetera. It is dramatically different. And all of our experience has been fighting against somebody that doesn't have a valid Air Force. They don't have a Navy. They don't even have the industrial capacity for any really matter. When you're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, the Taliban, et cetera, they had nothing except a bunch of rifles and, homemade bombs, et cetera. And when that's all of your experience, and then you go up against somebody like a Russia or a China, or like the Russians have against the Ukrainians, where it's huge number of artillery shells. It's, of course, the ever-present drone capability. And I've talked to men who fought on the front lines there, and they say, man, you can't even get out of your slit trench on the front lines without some damn thing coming out of the sky and hitting you, whether it's a drone or a missile or something else. We don't have any experience at that emotionally, psychologically. And I can't tell you how important that is in combat effectiveness for your troops to not understand how that works. And we saw it play out with the Russians when they first started, and we saw it when the Ukraine side, when they first tried their offensive, the big offensive in 2023. Both sides suffered huge losses because they were not used to that in terms of their overall force of how to conduct those operations. We have none of that right now, experience I'm talking about. We have concepts and training exercises, et cetera, but I'm just telling you that is a big, big difference between theory and actual operations.
And in terms of the consequence of what you're saying, if America did fight a major war with China or Russia or another country equivalent, would America lose that war?
Of course, you can't predict anything. You can, you look at like what happened with the Russians. They suffered huge losses and a lot of setbacks throughout the entirety of 2022, and yet they were big enough to overcome those losses and absorb them and make the changes, and now they're in position to actually win that war. And so that could be America's case too. It would depend entirely on how big the loss was. But look, Russia had somewhere around 900,000 active forces when they started there. So when they suffered a whole bunch of losses in the first, they could absorb that. We've got 452,000 to start, whatever would happen, because unless we have like 9 months of time to prepare, and we could call up the reserves and call up the National Guard, et cetera, and build the force up, unless that happens and we get a no-notice type of event right now, you go to war with the army you got, not the one you wish you had. And right now, the one we got is inexperienced and it's small. So if the loss was big enough, then yes, you could absolutely lose a war. And I know a lot of people in the West don't like to think about that, but it's arrogance to suggest that, no, we couldn't lose a war, because I'm telling you, we could.
This week represents the anniversary of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. You fought in that war after 9/11. Were the authorities at the time lying about how successful America was doing in that war?
Uh, yes, I was outspoken, and going back to 2009, that in public writings in military journals, that if we didn't make major changes in how we were conducting that war, we would one day lose. And of course, at the time, it was ridiculed because they're like, yeah, are you kidding? The global superpower of the United States can't beat these guys who just run around in bed sheets and flip flops with rifles, etc. But the problem is the fundamentals that undergirded all that were evident even then. And then when I actually went over there for my second combat deployment, I went first in the 2005, 2006 timeframe. When I went back in 2010, 2011, it was painfully evident that all of these claims by the likes of General David Petraeus and American congressional testimony and other kinds of public officials and the generals that were going on TV all the time, absolutely lying. It was never getting better. We were never on the right path. The same fundamentals that I existed were flashing red lights in 2009 were now with blaring sirens to go along with it in 2010, 2011, and it was self-evident that we were heading towards loss, and that's exactly the way it turned out in 2021, of course. So yes, they were lying. You say deception, or some people can say, well, they were just being, all overly optimistic. There was some of that, but there was also way too much intentional deception. And the difference between the two is I know how bad things are on the battlefield here, but I'm going to shield them from you, and I'm instead going to say something, that makes it look good so that we have more time. Whatever. I don't care what your excuses are or what your rationale was. You lied, and the American people in Congress supported a war that they should never have supported and probably wouldn't if they'd have known the truth. And that's exactly what happened.
There seems to be a parallel with Vietnam when, at the time, American authorities were claiming these great victories, and actually that wasn't the case. Do you believe, or why do you believe that America lost that war ultimately in Afghanistan?
Because we refused to acknowledge ground truth reality. The things that I identified in 2009, there were plenty of people. I certainly wasn't the only one. There was a number of people that were repeatedly, I think the CSIS continued to pump out stuff all the way through, which was accurate and talked bluntly and plainly about the roadblocks of this, because basically we're seeking to win a military outcome, or we're seeking a political outcome with military power that's militarily unattainable. Because you can't just defeat an insurgency with the conventional military power, because most of what the Taliban was fighting for was a mentality. You can't destroy a mentality with a bomb. You can kill people, you can blow up a lot of stuff, but you can't destroy a mentality. And especially in Afghanistan, because of the experience of the British and of the Soviet Union, the same fundamentals existed then, which existed while we were there, which exist today. It's the same kind of thing. It's not trite to say it's the graveyard of empires. There's a reason why that was the case. It was very fundamental, and those conditions continue to exist here too. And instead of acknowledging that you just can't go out and do it, and let me give you one example why. The Taliban were an insurgent and a shadowy group. I remember there's one day in particular which really crystallized this. I went out in the Kandahar area on a patrol where the U.S. forces had just won a big tactical victory at a small village, and they were setting up a new defensive forward position from which they were then going to go out and try to conquer more territory here. And as we're setting up a defensive machine gun position on the roof of a certain village house that it kind of overlooked the edge of the forward area, there was a big wheat field out there. And I looked off in the distance, and I could see, even with my naked eye, and I used my binoculars, and I said to the guys who were putting the machine gun position up, I said, hey, those guys, there's like four or five shadowy figures sitting there. They're all dressed in black, and I can see them from maybe here up, but very clearly I can see them. I said, are those guys Taliban? And the answer was, maybe. We don't know, but they could also just be the farmers, because a lot of the people here were helping to try to get rid of the Taliban, because they don't like the Taliban, but sometimes they're farmers by day and Taliban by night. We have no idea who it was. And that was symptomatic of the entire operation. You can't just go kill all the men because they might be Taliban, because then, of course, you create far more, and we did every time we did mistakenly kill somebody that wasn't the Taliban, that we create more enemy than we ever took off the battlefield. And that was graphically shown when I was there when I left in 2011, late 2011, there was about 20,000 estimated Taliban fighters. In 2020 or maybe 2019, I can't remember the exact date, there was estimated 75,000. So no matter what we've done with that whole surge, instead of diminishing the threat, it accelerated and increased to the point that finally they ended up winning the war.
After 9/11, America obviously united and felt that they wanted to enact revenge against these terrible terrorists who had killed so many innocent people. But there was also an atmosphere where perhaps you couldn't criticize the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan without being called unpatriotic, for example. Can you talk a bit about what that was like? I don't know if you experienced that yourself, if you're saying you were a dissenting voice against the war in Afghanistan. What was that atmosphere like, and has that changed over the last 20 years?
Yeah, in the immediate aftermath, there was just this, thirst for revenge. Everybody wanted it, of course. The government wanted it. The people wanted it because of what happened, and they're ready to punish whoever. It didn't matter who. Somebody had to pay for it, etc. So we went in there, and because the Taliban weren't part of what happened on 9/11, they had just tolerated the presence of those who had planned it from everything we'd been told. And now that instead of them giving them over, they said, prove to us where's the proof that these guys actually did it? We're not going to hand them over unless you have proof. And if you do have proof, then we will. That was the question. Of course, we didn't want to hear any nuance. We just said either give them over or you're going to be just as guilty as they. Of course, then we went in and attacked. Now, one can argue, and I have, that even if that had all been accurate and reasonable, then by, say, the middle of the first part of 2002, all of the Taliban had been destroyed as an entity, as an army. Al-Qaeda had been scattered to the four winds, and we later found out that there was maybe 50 in the entire country that was left over. So by any rights, we should have declared military victory and the political dimension solved by the military power, which was achievable and was achieved, and we should have withdrawn, and we should have become now then a humanitarian mission or a United Nations mission, because there was no more enemy to defend. And it was, when I first went in 2005, by the time I got there, there was starting to be a little bit more of these internal terrorist attacks, et cetera, and insurgent attacks, but they were so minor. I was able to drive around the country in a pickup truck with no body armor and nothing but a pistol on my side here and felt safe. That's in 2005. So if we'd have left in 2002, when there was no kind of organized enemy, then Afghanistan has its chance to form this new government and do whatever they want to do, and it didn't need to be military. But because the military was there and then started growing year by year, the attacks against the military started growing, and then it became what we call a self-licking ice cream cone. Every time we put more troops, there was more attacks. We put more troops, et cetera, until you had the big explosion with troops there in the surge of 2010. And there was never, once it became that, it takes on a life of its own. It's no longer about security or anything else. And then, of course, Bush changed it to a humanitarian mission. Obama doubled down on that. And again, you're trying to use military forces to achieve something that's militarily unattainable, so it could never succeed or meet its objectives. And no one's willing to even think about it. Now then, you have the case, and to your point here, yeah, this is still very much in account now, is that, well, we can't withdraw because then it would hand a victory to the enemy. Now, obviously, we ended up doing that anyway because they won a victory. But that's what's being said right now for our U.S. troops in Iraq and in Syria. The idea that we can withdraw them, everybody says, no, that would hand a victory to Iran. Now, it's a different enemy there. Even though the people just aren't aware, who say that with the most enthusiasm, have no bloody idea that those troops do nothing for American security. They're literally in these little dots around the desert in Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, defending themselves. And sure, they periodically take out what they say is a senior Al-Qaeda member, a senior ISIS person, whatever. You can do that all day long, but I'm telling you, that's like trying to drain a swimming pool on a rainy day with an eyedropper. Every time you put the eyedropper in there, you can take out water, and so you say, yay, look, we succeeded. But the overall problem is unchanged. And that's exactly what we have here. But the mentality that, oh my God, we can't withdraw or it's going to cause all these terrible things is just deeply ingrained. And I have not figured out how to fix that, even though practically speaking, it's absurd.
And what's your view of the current vice president and president in terms of their policy in Afghanistan, their foreign policy. What do you think about Tim Walz and his so-called stolen valor scandal? What do you think about Kamala Harris's foreign policy? Can you just give us a bit of an assessment?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what Kamala Harris's foreign policy is, quite frankly, because the only thing that we've seen from her so far as vice president has just been echoing what the president said, which is what she's supposed to be doing. So I don't know if that means that's actually what she thinks, and she's going to keep doing what Biden had done. It's unclear. On the specific issue of withdrawing from Afghanistan, I actually gave President Biden props for doing the hard thing and taking that huge political hit to withdraw because it made the most sense. I also gave some criticism for the way it was conducted, which was hideous. Could definitely and should most assuredly have been done a lot better and could have been. But then you see what their foreign policy is. Apparently Biden and Harris are the same in the Middle East, in terms of Israel, in the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think those are both terrible and unsustainable. And I can go into detail if you'd like.
And just two more questions. Why do you think the US stayed so long in Afghanistan and Iraq? What was the you say you could have got out in 2002. Was this to do with the military-industrial complex? Was this to do with Dick Cheney? What do you think the reason behind that was?
Yeah, it's a combination of all those things, but there's just this mentality that is just deeply ingrained that's not rational. It's theoretical, where you think, oh my God, we keep saying that, we can't leave because then our security will be threatened. No one knows what that means. No one knows why. Most of the people who say it can't tell you how that's going to cause any trouble. And as evidence of it, you see, we withdrew from Afghanistan now 3 years ago. Have there been any terrorist strikes? Are we any more at risk today than we were before? We are not. As I argue vehemently, there are somewhere around 75 different designated terror groups that are a threat to the United States by the State Department. They announced they have a website for all this. And we have troops on the ground in like 3 or 4 of those around the world. But what do we do about the other 72 where we don't have troops? Do we not defend ourselves? Of course we do, because our efforts, especially after 9/11, are that we have a much more effective and robust federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, coordination with friendly nations' intelligence services to completely monitor all over the globe. Anywhere that the threat may occur to us, we have to try and defend ourselves from it, and we are very, very successful. But this idea that but Afghanistan, the dirt there is different than the entire rest of the globe, and if we don't have troops there, then they're going to somehow magically go to that one place and then come here, as opposed to the other places all over the world where we have no troops, where we have no assets, anything else, where they can go. Because it should be logical then, if you think about it. If you're a bad guy and you have intent to do harm to the U.S., where are you going to go? Are you going to go where they have troops, or are you going to go where they don't? Obviously, you're going to go where it's easier to operate, which is anywhere besides where they have troops. So having troops there won't protect you. It just means they'll go somewhere else. And of course, they're not stupid. The bad guys aren't. They're doing the same thing that we do. We got Zoom, we got Telegram, Twitter, whatever, all kinds of means to coordinate electronically, no matter where in the world you are. That's just how the world works today. But we can't divorce ourselves from the thought that the whole rest of the globe works one way, including the bad guys, but somehow we can't get out of the analog of the earlier in the 20th century that you have to have a combat troop on the ground. So the bottom line is, even though rationally I can paint all day long why it's irrational to do what we're doing, the United States, especially the so-called political elite who have power over this stuff, just can't separate it. And I don't discount that it has something to do with the military-industrial complex, because they benefit from this way it is. They love the analog stuff because it really works good for the bottom line. And whether intentional or not, it does influence people, because they give money to these congressmen and tell them with briefings and everything with their people that they use to lobby congressmen, we've got to do this, man. We have to get this capability. Otherwise, your constituents are going to be at risk. And of course, it's all too easy to agree to that if it also comes with a lot of money for your campaign. And so, yes, it does influence stuff. And the bottom line is our security is actually worsened by this system instead of helped.
And just finally, what do you make of Donald Trump's foreign policy? Do you think he would make a good president again in terms of the foreign policy in the Middle East and so on?
Well, certainly his views in Afghanistan is the one big differentiation between him and the Democratic side, because he's saying, I want to end the war. I want to get a negotiated settlement. I'll do everything I can to bring that to a conclusion, which I strongly concur with, because and I could spend another hour explaining to you why we need to end that war and why there's no good thing for continuing to have it waged. It can never be won by the Ukraine side. So let's don't go against reality. Let's make sure our interests are taken care of, Europeans' interests, NATO, etc. And so that's what he would do. But then when you look in the Middle East and in Asia, frankly, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two sides. And there needs to be a lot of changes in what they should do. But Trump, his mentality, though, overall, is to avoid conflict, whereas it seems the current administration has a much lower threshold for wanting to use military power. So in that regard, I think Trump would be better foreign policy and national security-wise for the United States.
Daniel Davis, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.